Welcome to our next video, which will provide some background information about Exodus chapters 1 to 15, which is describing God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion that I led a few years ago, and it's edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what's going on in these significant chapters. So let's get started. Exodus. And it's really the start of the journey for God's people. Genesis was the beginnings of it, just kind of the beginning kind of formation, identity, kind of working through who the family is. Now they're starting to engage more with the world in terms of the story. And so Exodus has really two parts in terms of the timeline and characters and just kind of laying out those ingredients. Book 1 is Israel in and journey from Egypt. That's chapters 1 to 15. It's basically until they get to Sinai. And then chapters 16 to 40 is their journey to and arrival at Mount Sinai. So when we look at God, he's all powerful, he's authoritative, and we see that, especially with his judgments. And yet don't miss how he is really seeking to partner with God's people. He's revealed to Moses as Yahweh, who is I am who I am. And that's in chapter 3, making himself known as a present and personal God. And so we'll see that be developed through this story. Moses is one of the most prominent figures in the Old Testament, and he's the protagonist of this book. He's dynamic and he's relatable. He's this conflicted deliverer partnering with God amidst his emotional ups and downs and feelings of insecurity. So he's a very relatable human character. And yet he is faithful to serve God's purpose, to both courageously free his people and to patiently prepare Israel to become a nation as originally promised to Abraham. And so Moses is a really significant character in the Old Testament, and we really get to know him through these verses. And then Pharaoh is the loud antagonist of the story. He's seeing himself as God. He opposes Moses, ultimately hardening his heart to anything Yahweh, the true and only God of gods, wants to accomplish. And so as we look from the timeline and characters into the general plot, really what's unique about Exodus is just how you get really engaged with how evil the world is, and really opens with evil in our world resisting God's plan. And that's what is really distinct about Exodus. Genesis, in contrast, it's a lot of the primarily consternation in the family of God itself. And now we kind of engage outside the family to engage with the world. And so God's people who flourished in Genesis are now enslaved by Pharaoh, and he's really distorting God's image bearers into animals for the world's purpose, not God's purpose. So that's a big reason why the judgments come, is God said, be fruitful and multiply, and Pharaoh's resisting that. And so when we think about Genesis 1, we're made in the image of God. We're to partner with God, represent God. We're really going to see that in Moses's example to us. But furthermore, God's people are without a land for God to dwell. So if you remember, for God to be, in a sense, real in that time and place, they needed a people, a land, and kind of an understanding of who God is. And so God's people are without a land for God to dwell and to partner with for his purpose, to bless the world through them. And so God sent Moses to rescue his people, and then also to create a covenant between his people and God so that God can dwell with and lead his people. So God dwelling with his people is a huge theme in the story of Exodus. And so the story is really driven by that. It's our relational God who wants to dwell with his people. He's relational, he wants to dwell. And it's so that the world may know him through them. You see that over and over again in these first 15 chapters, how God wants himself to be known. And so we see this in the plagues, which demonstrate God's power so that the world may know him. We see this later, we'll see this in the giving of the Torah, which is a law given so that God's people know his character. And then we'll see this also later on in the giving of the tabernacle, which is where God wants to dwell with his people, to really personally partner with them to restore his world. And so that's really looking at Genesis as a whole. And so as we're going in to these first 15 chapters, just kind of think through this in the back of your mind. But book 1 of 2 is really the Exodus journey from Egypt. And we're going to look at 3 acts. There's the Prelude, which is really setting things up. And we meet the main characters, the problem in the story, the development of the main character, Moses, is really a significant part of these first 7 chapters. And then Act 2 is really the conflict in the story. And that's really this rising conflict of really the plagues sent by God through Moses against Pharaoh. So again, those are kind of the characters that we're looking at. And then the third act is deliverance. And so Israel's deliverance is, God's people are freed by Moses through Pharaoh, God's people are freed by Moses from Pharaoh to partner with God to become the blessing God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's so that they're moving forward towards the promised land, which is where this is going in the future. And so as we think of, the general plot and really kind of the message of what we're looking at here, God hears the cries of his people. He is present. He might not seem, from the Israel's perspective or Moses' perspective at times, he might feel distant, but he is there. And he sends his deliverer Moses to represent him. So again, it's kind of that image of God coming out, that Moses is showing us what it looks like to partner with God. And so Moses is going to represent God to those who oppose God's gracious will. So again, we're entering into part of the story where there's a lot of resistance from the world. And it's ultimately demonstrating God's sovereignty, not only overthrowing the powers of this world, but freeing his people. So it's not just dealing with justice, but he's working to deliver his people that he seeks to partner with. He wants a relationship with, and he wants them to serve his purpose for the world. Worship, when it's talked about, going out to worship, it's really this idea of service to God. And so God's commitment to his people has never been stronger, showing his strength over this world and his trustworthy presence in their lives. And so let's look at this first act. And and talk about setting the scene. I never saw this before, but the author first reminds us how God's people arrived at this point in the story. So as we're entering into Exodus, the author is really understanding where this connects from the previous book. The beginning 6 words of Exodus, it says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob." And that's an exact repetition of Genesis 46:8 when Jacob's family moved to Egypt. So literally it's bringing the reader back into Genesis 46:8 when they moved to Egypt and reminds them of God's work. God's people are fruitful, they're multiplying, and that's a sign of God's continued presence and blessing. He wanted them to be fruitful, he wanted them to multiply. That's what's happening, that's God's will. And so they, like their fathers, are fulfilling the creation mandate of Genesis 1 and 2, which is really driving this story because that's what caused Pharaoh's antagonism towards them. And so that's where, their faithfulness to God creates problems for the new Pharaoh, who, unlike the reader, as we, understand where we've been coming from in Genesis, Pharaoh forgot God's blessing to Egypt. Remember how they faced so many years of famine and had so many years of plenty. And it was because of Joseph that they were saved and grew as a nation. And so Pharaoh forgot that. Pharaoh forgot God's blessing to Egypt through Israel. And now and this is key, he seeks to reduce and bring down God's people by oppressing them and killing them. He wants to murder all the male infants, which I think speaks to the heart that Pharaoh has. I think you talked about that, Albert. What kind of man is Pharaoh? Well, this is who he is a man who wants to kill all these male infants. And yet we see after chapter 1, the despair is immediately interrupted by the birth of a savior, Moses. And he, escapes Pharaoh's failed attempt at genocide, giving hope to the reader And then if you look at chapter 2, verse 3, this was fascinating. He's literally set into the word is an ark. And that should remind us of Genesis. Just as God faced evil in Genesis 6, he's now recreating a new people, just as he did with Noah, and he's going to do it here with Moses. And so that's almost kind of bringing us back into another aspect of Genesis when there was evil in the world that was really pronounced, and God provided Noah, and now he's providing Moses. And so now Israel's deliverer, and whether Moses grasped it at this part of the story, it's a little unclear, but he goes from privileged status in Pharaoh's house to fugitive to exile, which is going to become a theme that we see in the life of the people of the Jews. And so he's recognizing injustice, but as he steps in, he's faced with opposition. And so the Egyptian prince must flee for safety to be welcomed by lowly shepherds to restart his life again in the wilderness of Midian. So while he's there, he's settling down. The situation in Egypt was not settled. And so there's a contrast between Egypt, what's going on for the Jews and what's going on for Moses. And God hears the cries of his people. And so he personally called the shepherd Moses. And why in a bush that's inconsumable? Well, fire is a sign of God's holy presence. In Exodus, we see that in chapter 13, 21, 19, 18, 24, 17. And so God's catching his attention. It's as God made himself known in that bush through this angel, Moses stepped towards him, and then God spoke. And so he got his attention, and he really wanted to confront in Moses what has been long forgotten in exile. There's a lot of themes of knowing God, but there's also kind of the opposite of that, where people forgot. And so God introduces himself again. He says that I am who I am. He's this unchanging existence who's still committed. He remains committed to God's people who need a deliverer. And so Moses, as we talked about, is this reluctant leader. He questions Israel. He questions himself, and to the point that God gets angry after the fifth challenge. And yet, through God's patience and preparation, Moses returns to confront Pharaoh so that Israel is freed to serve him alone. I know at this point in the story, there's a kind of a switch, and Albert, we had talked about this a little bit in chapter 4, 18 to 31. There's kind of some hard sections there that get a little confusing, and the way that God got angry at him. And so I was looking at that as part of the, what is this in the story? How is this moving things forward? And it really was this kind of final preparation for Moses's task as he's returning to Egypt. God's really preparing him. And so as that moment happened where he disobeyed God's command, it's best explained as a foreshadowing, just as it introduces God's plan of deliverance that will be worked out. The importance of circumcision, which is kind of related to Passover, is stressed in that moment, which will be stressed later as well. And just as there's consequences on Egypt for not obeying the Lord, there's also consequences on Israel for not obeying the Lord. And so it kind of gives a foreshadowing to how God's going to hold Israel to the same standard he holds all of us. And so we get to this final scene, though, in Egypt that's opened with the transformed confidence in Moses. He speaks for God. He confronts Pharaoh. And it almost seems like soon God's promise will be fulfilled. And yet things get worse before they get better. And so Pharaoh's hardness of heart is resolute. He's disrespectfully questioning the Lord. He's this real villain in the story. He's burdening God's people that if you want, he calls them lazy. He's contemptuous towards them. He's like, if you want freedom, then I'm going to make it harder for you. And it's really to emphasize just that this is really not a battle between Moses and Pharaoh. It's with God and Pharaoh. And yet amidst the contempt towards God's grace, he warns Pharaoh. So think of that. He keeps warning Pharaoh, giving him opportunity after opportunity to turn and obey him as a true God. So there is a mercy that's happening in the way that these plagues are going to develop, that starts out with just a sign of snakes on the ground, and it's really to show his mercy. But before we get to that part, we see in dramatic conclusion, an exasperated Moses again turns to God like he did at the burning bush, but with the complaints of God's people. Why did you do this to me? I mean, what a relatable character that we're reading about. He's really, in a sense, blaming God for his troubles. And so Moses is at the end of himself, even before things get started. He's completely undone. He's questioning God's character. And what does God do? He responds, and he shares how there's a bigger story going on. And you really see that as we kind of near these plagues right before they happen. So it's kind of sharing this preparation of Moses for what he's about to do. And God really wants him to know that there's more at stake, which is God's character. God made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the significance of God's name is going to be understood at this pivotal moment for Moses, for Israel, for the whole world. And so the point of all of this is that God's people are never alone. They belong to him, God who rules creation and history. And what the Israelites could come to expect from God in their present situation is directly related to how he dealt with God's people in the past. So God is very consistent. He may feel distant at times, but all along he's sovereignly in control and working behind the scenes. And so you see that in just how Moses is saved, and how Moses finds a place of refuge in the wilderness, and how God speaks to him. It's just little by little you start to see God more actively involved through this story. And all along he's sovereignly in control. He's working. He sees and hears his people and will personally send and sovereignly work through a deliverer to save them. That was a really interesting part of the story that I'll bring up when we get to it, but just how God is working through Moses. Yahweh is in control, his personal name, the named God who makes himself known. His plan has not changed. He'll be faithful to fulfill his promise. His plan of deliverance amidst insecurities, amidst the unknowns, amidst the setbacks, God is steady, and he's really the security God's people needs. He really loves this people that he's really working through, and he wants them to serve him and him alone. So Act 2 is 7:8 through 10:29, and this is where Aaron and Moses confront Pharaoh with God's power. And this is the initial sparring between the rival gods. It begins with signs of a snake, leprosy, water to blood, which were as much for the Israelites as they were against Pharaoh. It's really, though, to show how the battles between Yahweh and Pharaoh, it's commencing, and it's really showing us how Yahweh's controlling creation, and showing one by one Pharaoh's impotence, his lack of power, despite his own grandiose self-image. There's Yahweh's unquestionable and unconquerable might. And so each plague had a specific purpose to demonstrate the reality of Israel's creator God. So I'm going to just kind of highlight those here. So just bear with me. This is really the 9 plagues leading up to the culmination, which is 10, the 10th plague, which is the killing of the firstborn, which ties into Passover. So that's actually part of the final act. So these first 9 plagues are really kind of preparing the way for that. So the first plague, so it's dealing with the water of the Nile, and for an Egyptian, the Nile was their security. It really was their provision, and they even personified the Nile and worshipped it as a god. And so it's not just water, turned into blood. It's an attack on the spiritual source of life for Egypt. So, but if you think of it, it's very strong, and yet, man, had Pharaoh stopped at that point, man, think of all the chaos that would have been prevented. And so that's what enters into the second plague, is really the chaos, a reversal of creation. And so the second plague, let me get to it, is the frogs in chapter 8. And you see how this chaos enters from a reversal of creation, with humanity having no authority over animals. So you think about that image of God theme. There's no authority over these animals, and even again there's an attack on the gods of Egypt. The goddess of childbirth in Egypt is depicted with a frog head. So this is an attack on the fertility god, possibly for Pharaoh's attack on the babies in chapter 1, when he stood against God's command to be fruitful and multiply, and Pharaoh was going to reduce that population of God's people. But then we get to the third plague, which is comes on suddenly. It's this pesky insect, which is described, in the English as gnats. It's kind of an insect like lice, and it comes out of the dust. And so the dust represents death. It's a sign of human mortality. So it's kind of giving a prelude that something worse is coming, that we come from dust and to dust we will return. There's no god of Egypt represented here, but this is the first one the magicians can't represent. So it's starting to show how God's more powerful than what Pharaoh's officials can do. And so then we come to the fourth plague, which is where are we at now? The flies. And so whereas the previous plagues originated in water and land, this one's from the air. So we did water, we did land, now we're doing the air. So it's kind of showing a holistic attack on what and who Israel is. This is the first plague where there's a distinction between God and Pharaoh's people, which continues through the remainder. It's really to speak in how Israel's God is transcendent over Pharaoh and his gods, that he can orchestrate this in such a way to make protection upon God's people and still have justice against those who are harming God's people. And so he's transcendent over Pharaoh and his gods. And this is the first plague to really destroy the land, which is showing an incremental increase in destruction. So that's the fourth plague. The fifth plague is against Egypt's livestock. And so that's chapter 9. Perhaps attacking the mother and sky goddess, which is a cow. So again, there's a sense of a spiritual battle going on. But also the animals given to humans for their strength. So again, as humans made in the image of God, we have authority over animals, and that's taken away. And so it's really an attack, on that. Not an attack. It's really God's judgment on their disobedience, and but an increase in the intensity of the plague is the point. So the sixth plague is the festering boils, and that's really painful. It's the first to indicate real danger for the Egyptians if Pharaoh doesn't change. So you start to see his officials starting to tell him to do something. This is really a turning point where for the first time, Pharaoh's refusal to heed the sign is attributed to Yahweh's hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And so now the point is that God is in full control. And so to this point, the hardening was on Pharaoh himself. We see in the beginning in 7:3, where at the very beginning of this act, before it even starts, God says to Moses that he's going to send them to speak on his behalf. And he says in verse 3, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land. Pharaoh will not listen to you. And so he's going to bring these great acts of judgment. And he'll explain more why as we go on. But from that point, he's saying that this is my work. And then what's interesting, though, is when you look at 7:13 with the snakes, it says that his heart was hardened. Verse 22, with the first plague, it was Pharaoh's heart that hardened. 8:15, the second plague, it was Pharaoh's heart that was hardened. 8:19, third plague, Pharaoh's heart that was hardened. 8:32, the fourth plague, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And then 9:7, again, Pharaoh, his heart hardened. And so the first 5 not including even the snakes. It's all of Pharaoh's heart that's hardening. It's now in the sixth plague, the boils, there's a turning point. And what's interesting is if you look at 9:16, God gives some commentary, and he says, for by now I could have put out of my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would have been cut off. But for this purpose, I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. So God is making himself known. So remember that big theme of Exodus, God is entering. He wants to be present with his people. He wants to worship. He wants them to serve him. And so Pharaoh's resisting that. And God is warning him that it's going to get worse. And so here he's really saying that you need to respond to me, but you haven't. And because of that, I'm using this to make my name known, which you'll see at the end when it talks about all the nations that they're going to enter into the promised land, that they'll remember this moment. And how could you not? This was the world power at the time. And so the sixth plague is a real turning point. And Yahweh continues to do his work. He's in full control. So the seventh plague, it's recounted in greater length and acts as a climax of sorts for what has transpired. Now Pharaoh will feel the full force of God's power. And this is the hail. Hail is really a sign of judgment in the Bible. And you see that in Psalm 18, Isaiah 28, Joshua 10. Hail is interesting because it's, all creation's affected. It destroys everything. And so that's really a heightened plague that continues to get worse. You see that in the eighth plague with the locusts, similar to hail in intensity, bringing widespread destruction to life in all its forms. It's a clear depiction of judgment by God in the Bible. And this is not just for all the world to know, but for future generations. So you see kind of this is for future generations to see what God is doing. So when Pharaoh had been mocking God's people and Moses, God is really, in a sense, making a mockery of Egypt, just at Pharaoh's pride and his resolute disobedience, resisting God's will and his good plan. And so again, God has a good plan moving forward, and Pharaoh's in the way. When Moses and Aaron leave, they are triumphant in knowing God's plan. It works, and Pharaoh's really brought to his knees. And you see the culmination of the ninth plague. Darkness is most certainly against the God of Egypt, because darkness is chaos. We saw that in the creation narrative. It's bringing Egypt back to the pre-creation chaos of Genesis 1. Which is to say God is in command. Creation is at his disposal. And so with all that said, of that kind of working through those 9 plagues, the first 5, Pharaoh's heart was hardening. The last 5, God hardened his heart to make his name known. And it really is leading to this point in the story where he's going to give the ultimate judgment with the firstborn. But leading to that point, it's to say the world is a counterfeit power. So don't be fooled. It's real. It is not lasting. So don't be fooled by appearances. God is a true power and will make himself known in his timing, in his way. And so now these 9 plagues against Egypt are not just a display of God flexing his muscles. It's really unleashing his creative forces against the enemies of God's people. Again, they were against God's plan of restoring his good world. And so creation is at God's command, both to deliver his people and destroy his enemies. God has complete control in the process of salvation. But we get to the climax here, the 10th plague, as God himself announces, I will bring himself again. So notice he's bringing, I'll bring one more plague. And so this is really God saying this is the last act, mighty act, resulting in Israel's departure from Egypt, which the story has been driving towards from the beginning. Heard their cries, sends a deliverer. Now they're being delivered. And so the death of the Egyptian firstborn is in a direct attack on Pharaoh's power, who's considered a son of the sun god of the Egyptian religion, building upon the ninth plague. But more than that, this is clearly retribution for Pharaoh's attempt to kill the male children of Israel in chapter 1. So this is God's justice for that. And so thoroughly and devastating is God's action that the Egyptians literally, this is the world power begging these slaves to leave. And so all said, Pharaoh's been used by God to demonstrate his power and purpose that he talked about, that we looked at earlier. And so what's interesting is then we go into chapter 12, it seems like almost like, wait, now we're talking about a meal. It's like, I know food is important, but this seems a little out of the blue. Well, it's to really show something that's important for the reader to know. The purpose of the Passover of chapter 12 is for the benefit of future generations reading this story who did not participate in the Exodus itself. So this is for us, which was hinted at in 10 verse 2. He said that, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandsons how I've dealt with partially with the Egyptians. So that was right before the locusts, that he's saying this is for future generations who did not participate. So this is to Israel for us as a part of God's people. And so the Passover creates this night of watching, like the Israelites did, to encourage God's people to participate again and again in God's deliverance of his people by kind of retelling the story and receiving Passover as a meal. And so by including an emphasis on celebrating Passover, what this meant is that Yahweh's act transcended this historical moment to deliver God's people from slavery in Egypt. Now this celebration has become the defining ritual for the Jewish identity. And every Israelite from this moment forward is to remember what God did and will continue to do. And so you see this remembrance theme now towards this final act. So it's like the culmination, they're delivered, and immediately God wants them to remember this for future generations. And you see that in Moses, that amidst the significance of this moment, he recalls how the bones of Joseph are to go with them. So that's kind of bringing back Genesis, fulfilling the patriarch's wish that God delivers Israel from Egypt, not because they deserve it, but because God has a promise to keep to Abraham and the other patriarchs that was mentioned in chapter 2. And so we have this reminder again of this departure as part of God's larger plan that he's been orchestrating for hundreds of years, coming to its climax. I remember even Abraham, when he made the covenant with God, that it was a future telling of this event. And then later on in Deuteronomy, we're going to look back and see how this was a climax of God's orchestration. So this is a big moment for Israel. And this theme of remembrance is also emphasized in contrast to God's people who, as they're after the Passover is retold in chapter 12, and it goes back to, the death of the firstborn and the actual Exodus, what happens so quickly, God's people forget. And they say literally that they wish to go back to Egypt, which is so confusing. But they see Pharaoh coming and his army is coming after them, pursuing God's people. Israel's unaware of God's purpose, not only to save them, but to maintain his covenant of his people, past, present, future. And so God, represented in the fire again, he is there and he's protecting his people, and he is faithful, working through Moses to create a way forward that no person would have ever expected through the water. So it seemed like a barrier to God's people, that they feel like, man, there's no solution. Even after what God did through Moses, they still doubt, they still don't know. And so God is faithful to miraculously lead them through the parting of the sea to the promised land. And so we need to remember what God has done. That's kind of the big point, which I appreciate what you're saying, Carl. We need to personalize this to see the grace that we've been given. And that's what chapter 15 at the very end, Miriam, who brings out the celebration of this redemptive work. It began with Israel and came to completion on Easter Sunday that we just remembered just recently. And the ritual of Passover back then, which is now for Christians, the Lord's Supper for us today, that Jesus called us to memorialize the deliverance that we have from the powers of this world, the opposition to God's purpose that was introduced in chapter 1. now we are remembering through the Lord's Supper the deliverance we have from the bondage, the slavery to sin. And we observe that as a way to remember God's work. And we participate that work, not literally, but in a way to remember by taking the communion elements. And it's really a celebration of what God's given us in Christ, the salvation that we have. But in this story, it's the salvation from God for God's people, that he delivered the Jews from this opposing force to God's plan. And God's presence is there. He's personally leading his people through their doubts, through their discouragements, through the delays, to overcome what opposes God's plan so that they can find new life and the possession of God's blessing. And so as we kind of bring Exodus to a close, it's a story of God's battle with evil, which has eternal ramifications. And so whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, we must remember, not that we are awaiting God's deliverance, but that deliverance has already come in Jesus. Jesus is our salvation. He has redeemed us from sin, the slavery we have to sin, and he's delivered us to live fully for God. But as we conclude with this, just some reminders as we look at book 1 as 2 books in Exodus. It says the being in Egypt and journeying from. And so now we're at Mount Sinai, and God's going to really work through Moses to really form this covenant with God's people and to really define the kind of relationship they have, and also the presence that God is working to be with his people. So, but again, the promised victor, wounded victor, promised in Genesis 3, he hasn't arrived yet, but is it Moses? The reader's asking, is this the one that was talked about in Genesis 3? Will God's promise to Abram's family in Genesis 12 be fulfilled in God's people? Is this the moment where they're going to really be this blessing that they saw in Joseph, but now that was in a sense stripped away from them through slavery because of Egypt? And so now they're kind of restarting as God's people, and again, and but to remember that there is a world system that stands opposed to God's purpose. Like, we are in a battle, and yet our Creator is stronger, and his presence is personally leading his people to partner in fulfilling his purpose to restore our broken world. So that presence is a theme in Exodus, that God wants to dwell and partner with us.